4:30. That's fine.
4:30.
I'm free. Apart, I've got something later on, but not till 6, so it's not a problem.
And I'll do my best to bring Wales into the answers as well. So.
Yeah. Well, I'm really Welsh focused. I do stuff with the IWA magazine and stuff. So I will probably be too Wales focused. So please balance me out, Nicola.
There's no such thing. There's no such thing.
Beg to differ on that one. Okay, I'm just going to copy the link over to the Facebook event and then introduce you all. Brilliant. Thank you. Right, scores up posture. Fantastic. We're now live. I'm sorry you heard my monologue there. I was posting it up. Okay, so we've got several people watching, so I'll begin with the introductions. So thanks again, everyone, for agreeing to come today for what I'm sure will be a really interesting event. And today we have 3 speakers. The first is the Right Honourable Dominic Grieve, QC, who is sitting in front of a really well-stocked bookshelf, which I approve of. Dominic is a barrister and a politician who served as Attorney General from 2010 to 2014. So from 2015 to 2019, he headed the Intelligence and Security Committee in the UK Parliament before losing his seat in the 2019 general election. And he lost the Conservative Party whip in October 2019 after months of campaigning against government Brexit policy. So Dominic is an expert in public law, and he served as the Conservative Party's Westminster spokesman on constitutional affairs. And if I'm right in saying you're a very strong believer in the unity of the UK.
Yes.
Brilliant. We've also got Professor Nicola McEwen from the University of Edinburgh. So Nicola is Professor of Territorial Politics and the co-director of the Centre on Constitutional Change. Since 2016, most of her research is focused on Brexit and devolution. So she's been research lead on the ESRC-funded projects, repatriation of competencies and the implications for devolution, and between 2 unions, the constitutional future of the islands after Brexit. So her new project, A Family of Nations, Brexit, Devolution, and the Union explores intergovernmental relations in UK-EU negotiations, future trade negotiations, and development of the UK domestic market, as well as the implications of Brexit for the future of the Union. And our final speaker is Mr. Jeremy Miles, MS. So Jeremy is Counsel General and Brexit Minister for the Welsh Assembly Government, posts that he's held since 2017 and 2018 respectively. So this April, he was also placed in charge of Wales's COVID recovery plan. His 2019 legislation, Wales Act, moved towards creating a codified statute book of Welsh law, making Wales the first of the home nations to organise its laws in this way, which is a really exciting piece of legislation, like really great. More recently, he's been a very vocal critic of aspects of the Westminster government's Brexit strategy, describing the internal market as an iron fist which threatens to smash devolution apart. Before running for office, Mr. Miles worked as a solicitor, specialising in the media sector. So throughout this event, if you're watching, you have the chance to ask questions. And if you do have questions, I'm going to ask you to post them into the chat at the side of the live screen. And then 15 minutes from the end of the event, I will start putting them to our speakers. Fantastic. So without further ado, let's begin. And to begin, I think we should just outline what the situation was with devolution and the union pre-COVID. So let's see if we can sort of sketch the field for the audience and sort of outline in what context the pandemic hit the union. So Nicola, if you'd like to lead on this, because I know a lot of your research.
Yes. So devolution was set up in Scotland and Wales in 1999, re-established in Northern Ireland. And I think the story has been one of both stability and change. So stability, leaving aside disruptions in Northern Ireland, but stability in the sense that the devolved institutions have become a very accepted part of politics in Scotland and Wales. They are really key institutions with a lot of public resonance, and people look to the devolved institutions. So they've become very deeply embedded in the societies. And I think one of the striking features is perhaps the extent to which pre-COVID, that hadn't really happened at the UK level. Perhaps devolution was something that had changed Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, but hadn't maybe changed the UK, or hadn't been accepted as having changed the UK in the extent to which it might have done. So it was maybe a kind of absence of understanding at the centre about the facts of devolution. On the change side, of course, devolution has gone through a number of different reforms since 1999, several times in Wales, several times in Scotland as well. But I think the key thing in terms of the context in which COVID landed was that Brexit had created a number of challenges between the governments, a number of challenges to the way that devolution was operating, and had led to something of a deterioration of the relationships between the administrations, would be my observation. Perhaps Jeremy will have an insider's view on that. And I think some of the issues and challenges we've seen from COVID have exposed and shone a light on things that were already evident.
Yeah, that's excellent, really excellent, thanks. And Jeremy, if you would like to tell us a bit more about what you were seeing as the challenges Nicola was talking about, that would be brilliant.
Well, I think what I would, Nicholas set the scene very well there in terms of the history of devolution, its establishment. What I would say really in the period before COVID, which seems like some time ago today, doesn't it? But the devolution settlement has, generally speaking, existed for most of its time in a context where obviously the governments, the devolved nations, plainly totally committed to it. And broadly speaking, that has been true in Westminster as well, until quite recently, I would suggest. And I think in the period coming up to COVID, plainly the biggest influence on it, I think apart from the political tensions which stem from having different parties, if you like, in different governments at different ends of the M4, was the impact of Brexit. And it became clear that the process of disengaging from the European Union was posing strains to the devolution settlement in a number of ways. So in terms of milestones in that, in October 2019, I think Welsh Government published a document called Reforming Our Union. We're a unionist government, we believe in the union, we think it needs significant reform. And that document laid out really some of that reform. At about the same time, we commissioned a commission, we established a commission in Wales to look at further devolution of the justice system, for example. So there were some developments in terms of reforming the devolution settlement on the agenda at that point. The other very big challenge, I think, and Nicola asked for some kind of first-hand experience in terms of intergovernmental relations. My personal experience was that during the May government, there was, despite the fact that governments at different ends of the M4 had profoundly different views about the relationship with the European Union and the fact of Brexit, there was at least, I think, a mature relationship between the governments, and one which basically, accepted the devolution settlement. David Lidington, when he was Chancellor in the Cabinet Office, was, I think, did a really good job of working with the devolved governments in very, very difficult circumstances. You know, we didn't agree on everything or much actually, but there was absolutely a kind of willingness to work together. There was a very marked change when the Johnson government came into office, and that is certainly not the case anymore. And I guess the reason I make that point is because the relationship between individuals ought not to be so key a factor in the functioning of the devolution settlement. Now, politics is politics, so it's always relevant to some extent, but it ought not to be relevant to the extent that it is, where goodwill, if you like, on the part of individual incumbents, I guess at both ends, but given the settlement, particularly at the Westminster end, is so significant a factor in how it works. So I think the Brexit experience was itself very, very challenging and continues to be. And at its most recent, I guess, what we saw was, you know, a major test for it, really, with the 3 devolved legislatures withholding consent for the EU withdrawal agreement bill start of this year, and the UK government proceeding with the legislation in any event. So from a devolutionist perspective, that tells me the devolution settlement needs fundamental reform. And I think we see quite clearly, you know, the limits of the devolution settlement as currently configured when you have a government in Westminster, which I would suggest is, you know, clearly intending on limiting devolution in many ways. I think the internal market bill is a good example of that.
Yeah. That's really good. Would you mind just briefly for our listeners sketching out what the current forums are in which intergovernment relations take place? So
Sure.
I guess before COVID, where and how did you communicate as 2 separate legislative bodies?
So there's a structure which is known as the Joint Ministerial Committee, which is the forum through which the 4 governments of the UK work together on various issues. So there was a forum established by Theresa May called the JMCEN for European negotiations, and there's one where the principals, where the Prime Minister and First Ministers meet together. And our contention as a government is that structure is not fit for purpose because it isn't designed to reach agreement. It's designed to consult effectively, which we think is inadequate. But that's the principal basis on which governments in the UK work together on sort of strategic issues of this sort. I mean, clearly in the context of an emergency situation, which the early stage of COVID was, I think it's telling in a sense that the JMC structure was not the structure to which anyone even thought about turning, because it's, you know, not really fit for purpose. Clearly in that context, perhaps unsurprisingly given the emergency setting of it, COBRA was the forum through which intergovernmental relations were conducted, and then after that a much more ad hoc set of quadrilaterals and so on.
Yeah. So to take away from what you've said, essentially devolution within Wales, what we have in terms of legislation was not complete. So you're in the process of bringing that into fruition nationally, but I guess not quite internationally, but intergovernmentally, there weren't what you would consider adequate forums to facilitate.
No, the 2 points are related, but in a sense separate. I mean, the devolution settlement, as it's currently settled, as it were, doesn't, in my view, do what it should do. But you know that even if you think it does, then there still needs to be a firmer, more rational, more robust, more resilient set of fora, mechanisms, decision-making structures for the governments to work together than currently exists.
Yeah. Dominic, do you have anything to add to this?
Just a couple of things. I mean, I agree with Nicola's characterisation that devolution has become embedded, certainly in Scotland, and actually also in Wales, even if at the beginning, I have to say, I think there was considerable doubt that really the Welsh public wanted devolution. They voted by a very narrow majority for it in 1990, after the 97 election, and with a 50% turnout, which I think could call into question their enthusiasm for it. But time has moved on. Of course, one of the curious features, and I think the regrettable aspect of devolution, was that in setting it up, Labour under Tony Blair were in a position that they were the dominant political parties throughout Great Britain, leave Northern Ireland to one side. And I'm afraid that the early stages of devolution were run a little bit like the old Soviet Union ran its stans. Things were dealt with informally between Labour Party ministers in various bits of the UK, and resolved that way. And one of the problems, I think, was that there was a failure in that period to start setting up the formal structures. So that when eventually that dominance started to disappear, and it did in Scotland with the arrival of an SNP government, and then again in Wales to a lesser extent. And then you got the coalition government in 2010. Actually, people had to scrabble around to start creating or using the structures that were supposed to be used, but actually had been underused. With the added problem that in the context of the relationship with Scotland, it doesn't apply to Wales, seeing that the Scottish government, the Scottish National Party, wants independence, it's a relationship which always has an underlying tension, because people are constantly trying to read into a longer term strategy changes to the current relationship, even though at many levels, my experience is that it works very well. I mean, I was struck by Jeremy's comments. When I was Attorney General, I made it my business to meet with the Lord Advocate and also with the Counsel General for Wales on a frequent basis to talk through matters of common interest. I don't know whether that's still taking place or not. I see him shaking his head, in which case this highlights to me, where I agree with him, that I'm afraid the Johnson government appears to me to have no strategic sense and to be behaving in a chaotic fashion. And this, coupled with Brexit, which has undoubtedly put great strains on the existing framework because of the repatriation of powers from Brussels, therefore creates a climate where developing sensible relations and putting them on a better footing becomes much harder. So long before COVID came up, we were, I think, in something of a process crisis, if not a constitutional crisis, about the way in which we manage that relationship. And it had crystallized round the Internal Markets Bill and the repatriation of powers. And there's a case to be made on both sides. You need to have an internal market. That means the United Kingdom, otherwise we're in big trouble. But the way it was done and the way it is being done has undoubtedly fueled a sense of offence in Wales and Scotland. Northern Ireland, as I say, is so complex that I shall leave it out of it for the moment. And I think that was unnecessary myself, and I think it could have been done differently. That's a personal opinion. But that's where I think some of the underlying problems are. COVID has, as we'll come on to discuss, simply brought some of those things out in a new way. But those problems were there, not necessarily insurmountable. And there's always going to be tension with devolution. I may have had a good relationship with the Counsel General for Wales, but it didn't prevent us litigating over agricultural wages. But then that was the sort of issue which needed to be resolved because of the opacity of parts of the devolution settlement, some of which are actually, particularly with Wales, less so with Scotland, but with Wales, been very, very unclear. And in fairness, the last Conservative government, David Cameron's, went some way to trying to resolve that by moving from a reserved to a devolved to a reserve model.
Yeah. So I guess now seems like a good time to move time forward and get the pandemic into play, unless anyone has anything else they really want to say about what the situation. Okay, good. So I guess what I'd ask is what's changed since, I guess, the start of the year? What's different now? Is it just sort of the existing tensions have become a lot worse, or has something more fundamental than that changed? So I guess, given that you're the one who's really in government at the moment, Jeremy, would you like to start on that one?
Well, I mean, I think looking at it from a Wales perspective, obviously, we certainly feel that there ought to have been more care paid to this idea of, four nations governance, really. So we're talking about a public health emergency, and public health is plainly devolved. I mean, it's, there are aspects of other parts of the devolution settlement which are complex. Actually, this is pretty clear from a devolution point of view. So it was apparent from the start that the four governments would need to work closely together. And I think, frankly, to be fair, at the very start, that was the case. But there was a point when the UK government went down the road of stay aware. I think that was the phrase at the time, when Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland were still asking residents and citizens to stay home. And, that was in itself, I guess, a feature of devolution in that different governments were doing what they felt was right for their territories. But the way in which it was dealt with at a UK government end, betrayed a lack of understanding of what could go wrong in the devolution relationship as much as anything, but no sense at all that this was a message which was calibrated for the audience in England, as it were. And I think that then began to set in train a process where it became progressively harder to work on a kind of, to work hand in glove in the way that, we certainly feel as a government would have been better. Our First Minister has said, what he would have liked to have seen is a sort of what he described as a regular, reliable rhythm of engagement, mindful that we're going to be making different decisions for different circumstances, but doing that in full knowledge, if you like, of each other's situation is the very least one could expect, really. At that time, I had to actually write to the Attorney General to remind her of the rule of law implications of, making declarations without being sufficiently clear in this very devolved world that they were limited to the rules in England. So, that was very kind of unnecessary and, unattractive, really. But from a Wales point of view, I think what's happened is there has been a growing understanding of what devolved government can do. We took a very deliberate decision for the Welsh Government communications team, I think unprecedented for us certainly, to brief the Westminster lobby about how devolution worked in Wales, and it made a big difference, to be fair. It was very productive. And I think you would probably say that I think most Welsh people, at least anecdotal obviously, but the level of people's understanding of what different levels of government do in the UK has, I think, become enhanced. That's good from a democratic point of view. But it's also, I think, created a sense that, people are making value judgments, aren't they, about which governments are dealing with it in different ways. Broadly speaking, people in Wales seem very content with the way the Welsh government has handled it. But I think that it has created a different dynamic in terms of a sense of confidence that we can do things, in a way which works for Wales. Now, if you speak to polling suggests that most people in Wales would agree with the sentiment. It would be better, really, for the four governments to be able to work together, on the one hand, and on the other, would also say that the Welsh government has done what is right for Wales and supports that. So I think there's a very complex but interesting, and I think quite a positive, if you're a government like as we are, which believes in the union and wants it to work better than it is working, actually that mix of sentiment, as a reflection on devolution is a good platform for that, really. I think just finally, if I may, what's also become clear in the context, as I was saying earlier, that the government in Wales wants to see the devolution of the justice system to Wales. And I think there has become a growing understanding of the kind of the way that justice works in Wales, the Welsh government creating criminal offences and the reserved service of the police obviously enforcing that, and the need to work between agencies, some of which are devolved, some of which are reserved in Wales, has been, I think, effective, certainly because of individual goodwill, rather than because the system is designed to deliver that. And I think there's been a very kind of living case study, if you like, of the costs of having a kind of irrational settlement. As I say, people in the system have made it work very well, but that's kind of been despite the system, not because of it, really. So I think that's enhanced people's understanding of some of those challenges as well.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask you a specific question on that before, I guess, bringing it out a bit more. I sort of wonder, looking at the system with legislation and justice in Wales, the extent, because you're doing a lot as an individual and also as a government to try and almost wiggle the Welsh system away into something a bit separate, but the extent to which you need external actors to help you with that, you need people from the third sector to kick against the legislation that you're making, and whether the sort of third party bodies in Wales are strong enough to do that.
Well, I mean,
Yeah, like in terms of looking at the challenges that people are bringing on the basis of Welsh legislation, they're very few and far between.
Well, there have been two or three, I think, that have reached my desk in terms of JR claims, as it were. So I think the level of, I think the level of challenge, I don't know. I'm not sure myself that in this current context, people have been principally focused on that. I think in this stage, as we enter, the second stage of it, if you like, the dynamics are very different. And there's significantly, I would suggest, more kind of scrutiny and a degree of skepticism. But I think that's common to all parts of the UK. I'm not sure I think it is the case that we've not had scrutiny. We've got a very well-established commissioner system in Wales, which provides quite a lot of challenge on behalf of certain groups. So we've got a children's commissioner, older groups commissioner. And there's been a fair amount of challenge about equality assessments in terms of impact of various interventions in the response to COVID. So I'm not sure myself that's actually a fair reflection. But I do think that, just to repeat the point really in a way, I think that it's important from an accountability point of view for people to have a very clear sense of, Welsh Government is taking these decisions and we are therefore accountable to people for that. And I do sort of think that's been enhanced in the last few months.
Yeah, I would agree with you as someone who's been living in Wales. It definitely has been. Nicola, you've been nodding a lot throughout this.
Yes. I think we're in danger of being a panel that just agrees with each other here.
Yeah.
But, I mean, I agree that COVID has raised awareness in England, and actually I dare say within the UK government, about the fact of devolution and where responsibility lies for public health in particular. I do wonder a little bit if there is the same level of awareness of what the devolved institutions can't do, and that's particularly in relation to financing the pandemic, really, and there is a dependence there on decision making by the UK government, particularly by the Treasury, to compensate workers, to compensate businesses, and so on. And I think because the devolved governments have become so visible in the response to the pandemic, it may have raised an element of expectation that they can't deliver. They don't have the capacity to deliver. They don't have the constitutional responsibility to deliver in terms of the financial aspects of it. And there is a bit of politics creeping in, particularly in relation to Scotland, where the UK government's response, particularly with the furlough, and then it's a little bit more complicated now, but has been used as a way to demonstrate the broad shoulders. This is a phrase we hear a lot, the broad shoulders of the union. So therefore, to strengthen the union and to celebrate it in the other issue that looms very large over absolutely everything in Scotland, and that's the issue of independence. One of the other things that's been striking this past year, and perhaps even more so from the Johnson administration than Theresa May's administration, is this language of four nations. The sort of discourse of the four nations appears a lot, but not quite following through with what that would mean. And in the case of COVID, we are having lots of discussions about the variety of different measures and potential confusion that results from that. And wouldn't it be better if we were all having the same message? Well, I'm not sure I agree with that. I think in any sort of system with devolution or federalism or whatever, there's always going to be a need to balance the ability to have diverse options that are responding to local needs and preferences with, in this case, some desirability to ensure that your message is clear. And where it makes sense to do things uniformly and do things together, then I think that would ideally be the way to do that. And to some extent that happened in the early months of the pandemic. But I think the problem now is that the decision making isn't happening in a four nations joined up cooperative way. There are decisions being taken at the UK government level, and it's not really realistic to expect then the devolved governments to sign up to those, because it would be better to have a four nations approach. You know, if you want to have a four nations approach to anything, it has to be governments working together to formulate the policy, not being communicated the essentials a minute before it's published, but to be part of the creation of a policy approach that is genuinely a four nations one. And that really, really is not happening in the case of COVID, and it didn't happen in the case of Brexit, and it didn't happen with the internal market. So I think that speaks to a bigger problem that goes beyond COVID, but we're certainly seeing it in the current context.
Mm. Yeah, I guess something really interesting, and furlough's a really good example of it, that you're bringing out there, is the difference between what people see as devolved and devolution, what devolution actually is. So I guess is this a situation that's really challenging what devolution is? Is it something that happens legally, or is it something that happens, you know, in terms of perception?
I think it's both. I mean, clearly there's a legal structure and there are constitutional responsibilities that different governments and different legislatures have, but then there is also public perception. And you see that, we've known this for a long time, but we see it also in the context of COVID, that the public tends to have more trust, feel more closely aligned with their devolved institutions. And that may be about proximity. It may be about their visibility. It's difficult to explain it, but that can raise a set of expectations about, you know, people turning to them in order to try to have needs met, and sometimes to lobby. It's something that comes with risks and challenges as well, because governments can't always deliver and can't always respond and meet those expectations. But that has tended, in the history of devolution, that has tended to lead to a greater demand for more competence, not the reverse.
Yeah. Dominic, do you want to come in?
Thank you. Firstly, you know, COVID has exposed what anybody who knew how the devolution settlements had been set up was going to happen, which is that health is devolved and therefore it is possible to make different rules. And I don't see that as being some threat to the Union of the United Kingdom. The whole purpose of devolution was to enable decision making to be taken at a local level on some matters. And I guess we now can see that, far from having a uniform UK approach, even within England, the government has now started to introduce, and I don't criticise this, different rules for different localities depending on how COVID is spreading. And I think it's also worth making the point that, although I am very critical of the Prime Minister's leadership, or lack of it, at the end of the day, it's quite difficult to say at the moment that the UK has made disastrous decisions compared to most of its European neighbours, who seem to be, you know, struggling under very similar problems, have sometimes made different decisions, but actually still seem to have the problem at the moment of the second spike, or however you want to do this, the second wave of COVID. So it's not as if the actual management of this is particularly incompetent. What is very strange is the inability of the UK Prime Minister to play a leadership role centred within the existence of a devolution settlement, which clearly gave him a very important role to play, but which, for reasons best known to himself, he doesn't seem to have been able to do, leading to tensions, politically, I would have thought, quite damaging for him. and in the Scottish context, undoubtedly exploited a little bit by the SNP. And I'm not saying that all the decisions of the Scottish government have been for political reasons at all, but inevitably exploited to try to highlight a degree of difference. And so that's playing out with the background of Brexit into the issue of, is this an indication that the union is suddenly coming to an end? I don't see it that way. I'm sorry Jeremy's gone, because he was saying we were all so consensual. I was gently going to disagree with him when he then moved on to say, and of course, we need to have the devolution of justice in Wales. There is an argument for it, but actually I happen to think there is an argument against it as well. Breaking up a unified justice system, which the judges are perfectly capable of applying Welsh law in Wales, statute law in Wales, and Welsh law and English law in England. I mean, that is something which they've already had to do in a number of settings, and I don't see that as an issue for them. What you're going to lose if you have two justice systems is the fact is you're going to have to set up two judicial appointments commissions. You're going to have a separate judiciary, which means that the cross-fertilisation is lost. And bear in mind the important role that Welsh judges have played in an English context. After all, the last Lord Chief Justice was a Welshman and very much rooted in Wales. And I'm afraid, I think it will almost certainly mean that you'll have two bars and two legal professions. I mean, that is a massive layer of bureaucracy. And that brings me to my final point, which takes me back to COVID. I mean, there is undoubtedly and inevitably an issue about where fiscal responsibility and economic responsibility lies. Although the Scottish government has tax varying powers, it has not ever chosen to use them in order to raise money. And so there is an issue over devolution, which is a genuine one, that ultimately decisions which may have profound economic consequences, those economic consequences fall on the Chancellor of the Exchequer at Downing Street. And he and the Westminster government have to live with the consequences. Now, obviously, the Barnett formula will apply the money. Ultimately, if there is less money for everybody, there'll be less money for Scotland and less money for Wales and less money for Northern Ireland. But the immediacy of the economic consequences of shutting down business do undoubtedly and are going to weigh more heavily at Westminster than they are going to in Edinburgh or Cardiff. And so I think and there ought to be, in a proper working relationship, a greater degree of understanding. But then coming back to Jeremy's point, where I agree with him, if you're not doing common working and sitting around a table and explaining your own difficulties in a sensible way, then you've probably only got yourself to blame if the devolved governments aren't responding in the same way to the problems that you're having to grapple with. But as I say, I'm sure if you had a Conservative member of Parliament speaking to you today, he might say, well, actually, they found it very difficult to deal with Edinburgh on this. I don't know. Just as we've noticed that this issue has arisen in the context of big cities which are in lockdown. I mean, we have to face it, facing a double crisis. There's a health crisis, but underlying that, there's another health crisis. There's a mental health crisis over lockdown. And there is an economic crisis, which is going to lead to rising unemployment, economic stagnation, and potentially huge societal damage, which will affect every part of the United Kingdom. And so that's a legitimate area of focus as well in deciding how the lockdowns or the measures that are taken are best applied.
May I just add a clarification on the tax and devolution? Because it's not true to say that the Scottish Government doesn't use its tax powers. It has to use its tax powers, and particularly since the last settlement, it now is responsible for setting tax rates for all people living, all workers living in Scotland. And so it has to do that. And it may well try to raise additional revenue through that route when it comes to setting its budget for next year. We just don't know that yet. But there is no country in the world that is financing the response to the pandemic through taxation alone. And the capacity to borrow is the critical issue here. Now, the First Minister has said on a number of occasions that she wants the UK government to borrow on behalf of the whole of the UK or devolve the powers to enable the Scottish Government to borrow. And that again is leading to a further demand for fiscal autonomy. Now, it's relatively easy to say that you would borrow when you don't have the responsibilities to do so, because clearly that is racking up a lot of government debt, and it is a difficult decision for any government to make about how far down that road that you go. But it just feeds into the politics of that. But I just wanted to I broadly agreed with everything else that Dominic said, but I just wanted to make that.
But I don't think we necessarily disagree very much on this one, actually. Clearly, this is an issue, and there is an argument that a devolved government should have greater fiscal autonomy, in which case, within what remit should it lie? Because obviously macro policy, if it isn't directed from one single centre in the country, is going to start to cause considerable problems. But I mean, in the United States, they operate a system by which the states can raise their own taxes. So I mean, this isn't impossible. I suppose the only point I was trying to make is that Scotland has had, not admittedly the opportunity of raising borrowing, but has had the opportunity of tax variations on income tax from the very beginning. And it has shown, perhaps understandably and prudently, a marked reluctance to make use of these and start to have a visible divergence with it.
But there is a divergence, though. There is a divergence in it, and it may not be that visible because it's in not adopting changes that are adopted by the UK government, and that they do, in fact, raise additional revenue there. So, but again, it's a difficult area. It's
a difficult one, but it does seem to me to highlight an area where people's approach to what the fiscal and economic environment is going to be is necessarily different. And as I say, it may be that this is an area that needs to be re-examined, and it could be done within the context of a union state. I have absolutely no doubt about that. Although that also then brings me back to the comments I made at the beginning, which is that because the SNP want independence, it is right to say that discussing change with the SNP has always been much more problematical than, say, having a discussion with the Welsh government about its desires for change on devolution, because it's always seen as being part of a wider political conflict that may never be resolved, but until really it's settled, is, I think, going to make some areas of cooperation that might be sensible much harder.
Yeah, I mean, what I'd like to come in with there, that was all really, really interesting. But I think maybe a bit comparatively about, Scotland versus Wales and the difference it actually makes, Scotland having those sort of financial powers, because people in Wales are incredibly keen to have them. They're not keen enough to sign the St David's Day Agreement, but they want them. And a lot of the problems, so for example, the thing you raised, Dominic, about Boris Johnson and lack of leadership, like, if we're going to be kind, you could say that he's in a bit of a difficult situation of having to be the Prime Minister of England and the Prime Minister of the UK. And would more devolution, maybe a federal model, help with that? As are these problems that can be solved with more or better thought out devolution, or is this a question maybe of just tweaking the model we've got?
Well, that's which one of us do you want to go first? All right, I shall have a go.
Yeah, go on then.
All right, I have first. We have a problem because, unlike some countries which can build a federal model based essentially on a reasonable, if not parity, the Spanish model, for example, is not equal, but one where the constituent parts can, to an extent, outplay or at least have equal, together can have equal force to the centre, does not exist. England is economically and in population terms dominant. And England is a centralised state. And I have to say the history of England suggests to me that attempts at regional devolution, for example, were always going to be doomed to failure, because it's not what people want. It's trying to impose on people a model that they're really not interested in. Much more localism, and I think we're beginning to see it with city mayors, does appear to work, but it needs to be very carefully structured, and it's all on a bit of an ad hoc basis. And I don't think it's ever going to create, unless we decided to have an English parliament, an English polity. If we have an English polity, that polity is going to be completely dominant within the Union of the Four Nations. So whoever's the First Minister of England, if we move to that sort of model, will be calling the shots. And the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom will be, relatively speaking, a fairly powerless individual. And I'm not sure that it's a model which will work. But in any case, if it were to be approached, we need a written constitution. And the problem is, to get a written constitution, you need people to settle down and have a really sensible discussion about the model that they want. I mean, I've talked about this and also come to the conclusion on many occasions that, desirable as it would be, actually the political reality is it's never going to happen. It will only happen, I suspect, if Scotland becomes independent. And then England, Wales, and whatever's left might decide to have a written constitution, but it's not going to happen until that event. It will only take place after some seismically damaging event for the UK. Everything tells me we can't get people together to do it. It would be a miracle. It would be lovely if it could, but I'm a realist. So I think we probably have to live with the structure we've got. Now, your point about our British Prime Ministers only considering England, I'm not so sure about that. Although, I mean, with Boris Johnson, I'm no longer in Parliament, so I can't comment, but it's certainly not the position when it came to, for example, Theresa May, because I worked, even if I had disagreements with her over Brexit, the work I did with her or talking to her made me understand that she saw the United Kingdom and its survival through Brexit as absolutely key, even if there were one or two rather strange members of Parliament on the Conservative benches who gave the impression that they really couldn't care less about this and only had English interests at heart. It's never been the case up to now. And as I say, even with Boris Johnson, I'm not persuaded. I think that he's reckless, and I think he's idle. And I think he's a deeply flawed individual. But I don't actually think necessarily attribute that particular thing to him of only seeing through things through an English prism. What is true, however, is that for many years, Englishness and Britishness have been subsumed as a vista. And unconsciously and subconsciously, there are quite a few people involved in British politics at an English level who still haven't understood that you've got to make a completely new system work. And that, in a way, brings us back to what we were saying earlier.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's really interesting. You're someone who really likes organic systems and working, yeah. You don't like written constitutions, do you?
Oh, I do. Well, I mean, no. I mean, I think written constitutions can work. But if you're going to have a written constitution, it will normally come about because of some event. France got new written constitutions every time it had a massive political crisis that was about to tear it apart. The Irish got a constitution because they secured independence and they became the Free State in 1922. That's when the United States got a constitution. We are a country with a long history of political continuity conventions, which are now being radically abused, something I complain about frequently. And there are some signs of disintegration. So the argument in favor of a constitution is absolutely there, but I am just a political realist when it comes to persuading people that this is something that they should embrace. I've been pushing it and doing lectures on it for 10 years. Saying could actually do something quite sensible here. But my impression from my politics is that it's going to be very hard to achieve.
What do you have anything to add, Nicola? And then there's a couple of questions on the...
Yes, a couple of things. One is that I would really discourage people to think that there is a settlement that will sort this, whatever this is, that there is a problem that needs to be fixed, and that it could be fixed by reforming devolution or whatever else it is. Of course, there are aspects of the devolution settlements that could be improved or that would need reviewed, or that in light of politics or whatever. We talked earlier about taxation, and from the very beginnings of the system of tax devolution, I thought it was a problem. The problem in putting so much emphasis on a single tax, and that was going to be, that would require revisiting at some point. But that's wouldn't be the end of the story either. And I think what we need is not just about structures and constitutions and settlements, but a culture that recognizes that when you have diversity within a single state, when you have multi-level government within a single state, you have to work at it. And that's something of, and federations, they talk about it in the literature and political science, we talk about a federal spirit, and that's not really to do with the constitution, it's to do with a way of working. And I think that's been missing a bit from some administrations, partly I think because of the what appeared to be a neatness of a reserved powers model, is that it's clear that this is reserved and then this is devolved, and then there wasn't really that need for joint working so much. Well, that I don't think was ever really the case, but it's definitely not the case now, particularly in light of Brexit. So you need recognition of a way to manage and work at the relationships on an ongoing basis, and to recognise that devolution is a feature not just of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but is a feature of the United Kingdom. And I think it's about then recognising the UK government needs to recognise, and the UK Parliament needs to recognise it as a feature of its own system. And just a point, if I may, about independence. I think it's important to recognise that independence is the fundamental belief of the SNP. It's an entirely legitimate belief. It's now supported by an awful lot of people, if we can read into the opinion polls there. And it's not realistic to expect that changing the way the UK is run or changing devolution will in some way make them or large sections of the population stop believing that independence is the right thing to do. But that's not an excuse for not trying to fix some of the problems that are within the system now, and particularly in the ways in which governments work together or ought to work together, or the machinery that supports that. The other thing is that independence wouldn't necessarily settle this either, because even under a constitutional settlement where Scotland became independent, you would still, it doesn't change geography. There would still be countries sharing these islands, and a need to continue to have an ongoing relationship. And in some ways, a lot of the heat could have been taken out of the intergovernmental discussions and the internal market discussions that are very current at the moment, if it was recognised that actually these are issues that would come up in any constitutional scenario, and that could perhaps have had a bit more buy-in to the sorts of very real discussions.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I'm really glad that you're bringing up humanity, basically. The one thing I was really scared of when I was setting this event up was it turning into like mudslinging, which there is an awful lot of when you're talking this.
But there shouldn't be. I mean, I agree with Nicola. Independence, I happen to think independence would be a great mistake, and I think it would be very damaging for England and very damaging for Scotland. That's my opinion. And I remain a unionist. I believe that the benefits of the union have been shown and proven to vastly outweigh the disbenefits, but everything comes with cost. I also agree with her, actually, about her comments that this isn't a reason not to try and make the system work properly that exists. And I mean, I share her concerns that the system has not worked properly for her, but that comes, I'm afraid, brings the politics in, and it's quite easy for us to detach ourselves. I mean, I've been out of Parliament for nearly a year now. So perhaps I'm beginning to turn into something rather different. But having spent 22 years in it, I think I'm alive enough to the realities of how political pressure works on individuals to say and do things in particular ways, partly to respond to their core support group or their voters, which I'm afraid means that some of the rationality of discussion that we enjoy having in this forum just doesn't occur in the same fashion. And this criticism can be made of all parties to the devolution, certainly to the sort of UK-Scotland relationship. So one has to be realistic. And I do think that I would love to see devolution work and hum. And in fairness, there I was Attorney General, I was explaining, I used to go to Edinburgh. I gave talks, I met people, I was able to see the senior Scottish judiciary. I met occasionally with Scottish ministers who were SNP ministers, and heaven knows, I had to cooperate closely enough with SNP members, MPs over Brexit. In my last 12 months in Parliament, we formed lasting friendships and mutual respect, even though we also happen to disagree fundamentally on independence. So of course you can do that. But, look at, just to sort of give a cautionary tale example, Ireland achieved its independence with the Free State, but my goodness me, the relations which followed were in the deep freeze for the next 60 years in a way that was damaging to all parties. And I think, admittedly, Ireland achieved independence in circumstances where there was violence, and it's different. But nevertheless, it does show what happens when emotion creeps into a relationship. There was a trade war in the 1930s. There was an initial period in the 20s, actually, when relations were rather good. And then it all completely fizzled out, and it went into the coldest freezer for 40 years, whilst problems bubbled up in Northern Ireland, unaddressed, lack of cooperation. The Irish president in the 1960s used to refuse to fly through Heathrow Airport. He had to occasionally, but he wouldn't leave the VIP lounge. I mean, that was the extent to which relations between two countries that had to cooperate in common had got themselves into the most terrible, as I say, ice age, rather than hot. It wasn't a hot relationship, it was a deep freeze relationship. We can't afford that. And that's one of the reasons why we've got to try to find sensible solutions.
Yeah, I mean, bit of a personal question, then I really should bring in the questions that we got in the chat. But I guess for me, I'm someone who grew up speaking Welsh, and you're saying, okay, we can't have emotion coming into this, I guess. But
no. Lots of emotion come into it. But
okay,
has to be matched with rationality.
Rationality. No, but I think, it can sometimes feel like there's a taboo against saying, actually what I value in terms of my existence and how I want to live is the ability to raise my children speaking Welsh, to live in a country that is in which I can exist through the medium of my own language. And that's, there are lots of rational arguments about how, Welsh, well, not so much anymore, but it used to be, it's the language going to die.
Yeah, but it was saved, wasn't it? It was saved by the Westminster government. I think. Yeah, I have a holiday home in Western Brittany, and France has effectively destroyed Breton as a spoken language. It's a mixture of things, and there are some events that flow from the Second World War which have contributed to it. My neighbours speak Breton, but it's a totally secret, private language. It's not spoken in the public space outside of societies that get together for doing it. You won't go into a shop. Very occasionally in a bar, I've heard it spoken. Actually, although, yes, there were measures in the education system that didn't respect it, the UK government, even before devolution came in, actually recognised the cultural importance of it within the diversity of the Union of the UK and took the steps that protected it. And just in time, whereas Scots Gaelic has been much, much more difficult to save. But your issue about identity, my family come from Roxburghshire. I'm a Scot, really. And my father saw himself as a Scot, having never lived there. He absolutely saw it as being fundamental to him. But we were beneficiaries of the Union. So my emotional ties, and I've got a son serving in a Scottish regiment of the British Army, so he certainly went into that for purely romantic reasons. Emotion does matter, of course it does. But I think one's got to try to make sure that the emotions of Scottish identity are very, very real ones, and people should be proud of it. But one also needs to look at the wider benefits, particularly the benefits that the union has brought. One of the things is we created a political nation, not a cultural nation, or rather we produced a political culture that allowed lots of diversity. It's one of the reasons we've been so good at absorbing immigrants, relatively speaking, compared to some European states. You don't have to dance around a maypole to live in Somerset. So it's quite important. And if you go to France, it's rather different. But anyway, so I'm in danger of digressing, but the union, I believe, has many, many strengths and has conferred massive benefits on all of us, while still enabling you very properly to speak Welsh.
I mean, I wouldn't totally agree with you on that, but I don't think now's the time to go down that rabbit hole, to be honest. Okay, we've got a couple of questions. So in terms of answering them, if you think you've got a particularly brilliant thing to say, do you want to just wave? Let me know. I think the first one's probably a bit more of Nicola's alley, because it's someone's asking people in Wales and Scotland are preferring their own government's handling of the pandemic, and it's driving support for independence. Is independence in Scotland now inevitable?
I don't have a brilliant answer, but the simple answer is no. Nothing. I don't think anything is inevitable in politics. One of the interesting, striking things about the support for independence, and it has been rising before COVID. I mean, it's not just about COVID. We already were seeing shifts in opinion polls last year, and that was explained by Brexit primarily. So we were seeing more people who had opposed independence but supported the Remain option, shifting towards support for independence. You also saw the reverse in Scotland. Sorry, you can probably hear my dog in the background. You also saw the reverse from between Leavers shifting from yes to no, but there were just far fewer of them in Scotland than there were Remainers. So that shift was already there. But Brexit doesn't explain the shift that we've seen this year, where we now have had, I think it's 9 opinion polls in a row showing comfortable majority support for, or suggesting comfortable majority support for independence. And that is against the backdrop of COVID and the handling of COVID. What it isn't is against the backdrop of debates about independence. There is no prospectus, there is no platform, there is no campaign. And actually, although Brexit has created the political environment in which there is a live independence issue and a case to be made, it's not for me to make it, but a case to be made to revisit the issue of independence again, Brexit also complicates independence, particularly because of what it would mean for the border between Scotland and England. And there isn't really any scrutiny of that. There isn't really a debate about that, or any pragmatic proposals to manage that border in the context of independence and Brexit. So we're still nonetheless seeing this rise in support. And I think it's hard to know, it's hard to pinpoint what that's about without the data to explain it to us. I think it is something to do with perceptions of handling the pandemic. It might also be to do with perceptions of the UK government more broadly. And I think the difference perhaps between the independence debate now as opposed to 2014 is that it's a bit harder, potentially a bit harder now to talk up the UK as the safe option, to talk up the union and remaining within the union as the safe option, because there isn't really a status quo position at the moment. Everything, government, the UK government, the UK as a country, Scotland as a country, they're facing enormous challenges in the years to come. So it's quite difficult then to counteract independence and talk up the risks of independence while apparently suggesting that the union is the safe bet, because it seems to me, no safe bets anymore in all of this. Of course, there are risks associated with such a fundamental constitutional change on top of one that is still going through the motions. Of course there is. But I think that when the debate does come, it will be quite a different debate from the one that we had in 2014.
Do you think that there's been a sort of shift in the burden of proof? Is that what you're trying to push towards?
No, not necessarily, because I think, I mean, at the moment, where it's talked about at all is talked about in process terms, and that's about whether or not there can be a referendum on independence. And position of the UK government has been that the issue is settled and no, and in order for the Scottish government to be able to hold a referendum in similar terms to 2014, it would require a transfer of power to legislate for a constitutional referendum. It would, and that's what is currently being refused. So that's a process issue. And in a sense, if that remains the focus in the run-up to the devolved elections next May, that in a way is a little bit of a let-out for the SNP, because it's relatively easy to argue on the process issue to say it's Scotland's right to decide, without having to get into the difficult substance issues about what exactly you would be deciding on and what independence in this context, in the context of Brexit, in the context of COVID would actually mean. So process is relatively safe ground for them, substance much more tricky, much harder.
Yeah.
I don't think I've got much to add to that. I mean, I agree with Nicola's analysis. Of course, we're coming back to what we were talking about earlier. There is this tension between emotion and also decision making on, I say, a rational basis. All rationality has emotion in it, so you can't take these, you can't disentangle these two things. But there are different criteria. At the moment, I'm not very at all surprised to see this surge in a general view we'd be better off without these people, because the opinion, which is oddly enough rather increasingly shared south of the border as well, is that the government is incompetent. So should one therefore be surprised that people are saying, well, seeing how incompetent it seems to be and leaderless, why in those circumstances wouldn't we be better off without them? But then you've got to work through all those other topics, which is actually how you would organize your life and whether your quality of life would be significantly enhanced and you would feel better and happier. And happiness of all the things is the most intangible of all and influenced by different considerations. So I certainly think that the union is under threat. Yes, I mean, that's been clear for some time, but it's not, it may well survive, but it's going to survive if the language of unionism can be adapted to the reality of devolution and the respect for the constituent parts of the United Kingdom. And if that can happen, then the union will thrive again. And if it doesn't, then we may break up. But as we can see with what's happened over Brexit, breaking up is painful in the extreme and brings in its wake all kinds of problems.
Who do you think at the moment will make that case and will take that on? Because I guess that's one of the big questions from not necessarily the English point of view, but just you've got the SNP, you've got Plaid in Wales, as they're nowhere near as strong. We know who's making the case for independence, but who's making the case for union right now? Unionism.
I think that's an excellent question, to which there isn't an obvious answer. And I mean, I suppose one of the staggering features of Scottish politics, it has to be somebody within Scotland, really, in terms of the issue of independence. This is to recognise that yes, what the actions of the UK Prime Minister and the actions of the UK government absolutely are central to shaping the debate, but it's primarily a debate that takes place within Scotland, between a Scotland that is quite divided on its constitutional future. And there isn't really a coherent unionist voice. There's a new leader of the Scottish Conservatives, but as yet untested, and who knows, in time he may grow in stature, but that's not there yet. Ruth Davidson, who was the former leader, was to some extent able to occupy that position, but now is no longer in that position, about to go to the House of Lords, and it's difficult to mount that case from the House of Lords, actually. And the Labour Party has become an extremely pale shadow of its former self. And that's one of the staggering developments since 2014, is the absolute collapse of the Labour Party in Scotland. This was the party of the establishment in Scotland for decades, and the party of Gordon Brown. And yes, he's still around and he still makes a contribution, but this party can no longer speak for Scotland or for union, actually. It's just struggle to find a voice in what has become a debate that's been quite polarised. And that's in some ways a pity, because there is within the public, I think, a recognition of that this is not just a sort of black and white issue. There's a recognition of the complexity of the issue, and there is space between that version of independence and that version of union, which is perhaps, there's one version of union that is advocated at the moment. It's not the only version of union. And there is space between these two ends for a conversation to be had about the future of Scotland, but nobody's really having it, or it's not visible at a leadership level where that voice is going to emerge from. So I think it's the key question as to who would lead that, and I don't have an answer for that.
Nicola is much better qualified to answer that question than I am in the Scottish context. I mean, I think there's no doubt that Ruth Davidson, when she was leader, and the 2017 election result showed she'd found a very, very focused pitch about what she was trying to tell the Scottish electorate, and it worked. Obviously, it didn't give a majority, but it delivered a large number of seats in an unexpected way and changed some of the terms of the discussion. And also, because I remember going up to help, it revealed large numbers of people that unionism was really very much alive in Scotland, with large numbers of people who want to see the union succeed. And she was able to tap into that, particularly at a time when Labour was leaderless. But I have no idea who's going to do it. Somebody's going to have to do it, or the argument may go by default. Wales is obviously very different, because the desire for independence, although it is there, particularly in some Welsh-speaking parts of Wales, it's not there otherwise. And the ties between Wales and England are so deep. I mean, even within rural communities along both sides of the border, which I know, an area I know very well, that it's not really a live issue. So the issues around Welsh devolution and Welsh identity are, I think, markedly different.
Yeah, I agree.
Sorry, Nick, can I just go back a little bit to link this back to some of the conversations we were having earlier about the relationships between the governments? And it's absolutely the case that, and we heard from the minister earlier, that the Labour government in Wales is a unionist government. But it's worth noting the extent to which that government is so very often on the same page as the SNP government in Scotland when it comes to their asks of the UK government and their critique of the relationships between the UK government and the devolved governments, and the status of devolution within the eyes of the UK government. And that should tell you something about the challenges that the union is facing. It's not simply about independence. It is about the status of the devolved institutions more broadly, but that will feed into the independence issue, particularly in Scotland, and actually also I hate to use this phrase because my colleagues criticise me for using this phrase to a lesser extent in Wales, but we use it quite a lot, but also in Wales as well.
Yeah, no, the Celtic pile-on, which does seem to happen. We've run 10 minutes over, which I'm sorry about. You both said you're okay with time.
Absolutely no problem.
That's fine. It's a good sign.
Okay, yeah, brilliant. I guess that would be the end of the event. Thank you so much for coming. It's been really, really interesting, and you've both been really brilliant.
It's been
You're
a great
very
pleasure.
welcome.
Thank you, Nia. Thank you, Nicola.
Thank you. All the best.
Thank
Bye.
you very
Bye.
much.
Bye.